Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way. Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Welcome, everybody. This is Breakthrough News, and you are watching the Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here alongside, literally, not figuratively, my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, I'm sorry we're using the wide shot so you can't do the thing with your hands. People can see that we're together, but happy to be alongside you in real life. I guess you could still do it.
Yeah.
Nevertheless.
Happy to be with you in real life, Eugene,
You.
coming to you guys from New York City in person.
Thank you.
Very exciting to be sitting at the same desk together.
Yes. Yes.
Very good show we have planned.
I think we have a great show, as we always do for you, and part of a wide range of fantastic content that we have coming to you here from Breakthrough News, like Dispatches with Rania Khalek. And of course, if you've been following us recently, you know, critical exclusive things like being the most embedded media outlet at the Columbia student encampment that shocked the world and led to a blossoming of student encampments in solidarity with Gaza worldwide. So I say that to remind you that since you are here watching on YouTube, this would be a great time for you to go ahead and hit subscribe, and go ahead and hit the bell so you get the alerts for the things that you have subscribed to, so that way you don't have to work very hard to get all of the excellent content that's coming out from BT on a very regular, basically daily basis. Rania, are there other things you would like for our viewers to know?
Yeah, you guys, if you aren't already, you should become a patron of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News for as little as, I'm about to sound like an infomercial,
That's
but I can't
okay.
help it. I've always wanted to do this, honestly. For as little as $5 a month, but in all seriousness, for as little as $5 a month, you can help support our independent media project so that we can keep bringing you all of what I would say is excellent coverage. We've been bringing you from the campus protests, from what's happening across the Middle East and around the world, especially as we have to deal with an insane tsunami of pro-genocide propaganda from a corporate media apparatus that just loves war. So if you oppose that war machine, become a member of Breakthrough News, patreon.com/Breakthrough News. You can also access exclusive merch like this very cool mug that, what did we say last time, Eugene? For like $20,000, we'll send you the mug with my lipstick on.
Yes, $20,000.
$20,000.
USD. Actually, I will accept 20,000 euro, but it has to be 20,000 of a strong currency.
Oh, yeah. So only first world currencies,
Yeah,
basically.
we want to get full value out of that lipstick stained mug.
But also
We'll take the gold equivalent.
Oh, good point. No, it's always good to have your money.
No Bitcoin.
No, we don't do that.
Too
kind of stuff here.
volatile. Gold only going
However,
up.
if you did make your money through Bitcoin, we'll still take your dollars.
That's true.
Yeah, don't discriminate on that. But you can also access
$50,000 in Bitcoin, actually, I would
Oh, you will take Bitcoin.
$50,000.
Wow, someone just was about to hit the button and they weren't, and now they are again. But also, you can access exclusive content like parts of my show Dispatches, as well as Eugene's monthly seminar in Africa, and other really cool stuff. But most importantly, if you are able to, you really should be supporting independent media like Breakthrough News, because it's what keeps us going, helps us stay alive, and helps us keep bringing you what's actually happening in the world, which we're about to do with a bunch of really great guests.
Indeed. We'll get this show on the road. On the road again, as some might say.
Eugene.
John Denver. What are you going to say?
I'm going to start singing the song.
Please don't. To prevent that, we're going to turn to our first issue and our first guest. Critically important issue, which is the ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo that has been heating up as of late. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Kambale Musavuli, who is an analyst with the Center for Research on the Congo, Kinshasa. Kambale, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for keeping up the Congo on your show.
Well, it's critically important, and it's obviously, one of the most consequential conflicts happening around the world right now. Let's start here. A couple weeks ago, Kambale, there was an attack on an IDP camp, a bombing on the city of Goma in eastern DRC, and, is widely attributed to the M23 rebels. Tell us a little bit about what took place there, because it was a very shocking attack, and what it says about where the state of the conflict is right now.
Prior to the bombing, the M23 rebels, backed by Rwanda, which to an extent, not an extent, they are actually supported by the United States and the United Kingdom. These M23 militia group took over a town, a specific town called Rubaya. Rubaya is actually the capital of coltan, if I may say, right? If you have a cell phone, there's probably coltan in it. And the people who dig the coltan, where it comes from, mostly is in Rubaya. So them taking over the town of Rubaya caused also the Congolese army and the SADC partner, particularly the South African troops, to launch an attack. And in response to that attack, the M23 decided to shoot at civilians. Not just anywhere. They actually launched missiles into a refugee camp, right in Goma, in the neighborhood called Mungunga, and close to also the area where Lac Vert is. Lac Vert is the Green Lake in the eastern part. So they bombed intentionally the two refugee camps. The usual thing has happened. I mean, this is not the first time this has unfolded in the past 2 decades in DRC, where these Rwandan-backed militias, Uganda-backed militias, foreign actors are actually targeting civilians. And as usual, we get the condemnation, right? The United States condemned the attack, directly saying that Rwanda is backing the M23 and they should stop. France does the same. The United Nations does the same. Condemnations are happening, but over 40 people have lost their lives. And the videos are horrific because we were able to get the videos from partners that we have on the ground where you're seeing children dead. I mean, these are images that we are seeing right now. So at the same time, in Gaza, we are seeing our brothers and sisters in Palestine being killed the same way we are seeing what's happening in Goma, right? The images of the children in the refugee camp killed in Goma is the same as what I just saw a couple of days in Rafah. They bombed the building and children were there. And as usual, be it for Palestine or be it for DRC, condemnations are taking place. So what we are saying is we have passed the stage of condemnation, right? We are at the stage where actions has to be taken. And the action that we continue to push at the Center for Research on the DRC is not just to look at Western nations, who are launching condemnation and so on, because it's hypocrisy, right? They are behind the conflict in the DRC. We are calling more on African nations. How come, up until now, I have yet seen a condemnation from the AU for the attacks? At least I have not seen that come out. I've not seen most African countries even speak out about the killing of civilians in a refugee camp. This is a war crime, right? I'm not hearing ICC investigation on the bombing of refugees. And the death toll in DRC has reached over 6 million people. Yet there is no action. So there needs to be greater accountability for African leaders, for African institutions around the situation in the Congo. And we should be clear about why they're being killed. That's why I started in explaining that when the rebels took over the area that has the coltan, Congolese bear the brunt by dying, right, through the missile that dropped. So there is a direct connection with the illicit trade, illicit exploitation of Congo's resources, and the effect that it has on the people. So you can't just talk about the bombing without actually pointing out that these militias went after coltan that is found in our electronic devices. And most of us will go ahead and start getting new phones the next day, believing what Tim Cook said, that they don't use any minerals coming from DRC, which is preposterous. It's impossible for Apple not using Congo's resources. And we are losing our lives in DRC, and we want it to end.
Kambale, can you elaborate a bit on that? I want you to break down who's benefiting, right? Because you talk about there's just condemnations, no action, but actually having some action would actually harm certain people's profits. So who's benefiting from all of this? I mean, why would African leaders be quiet? Why would Western leaders be quiet? What are they getting out of this ongoing conflict, this war in the Congo? And when we talk about the various forces involved, are they proxies for anyone in particular?
Yeah. I'll start from a very general perspective. You can talk about the situation in Congo without actually pointing out capitalism and what it has done in DRC, right? The access of Congo's resources is actually fueling the fourth industrial revolution. So when we start hearing people such as Elon Musk sending satellites to space and trying to provide internet to the world, he can't do that without Congo's cobalt, right? We're hearing this new VR headset from Apple being shipped to houses costing $3,000 to $4,000, making maximum profit from it. They cannot do this headset without Congo's coltan, right? So, from a general perspective, that the fact that we benefit in electronic devices that we use, we don't question how these devices are actually made. But at the very root of it, the resources are coming from the DRC, and the Congolese people are affected. On a geopolitical sense, right? Since 1996, Congo has known a war that hasn't ended. It has manifested itself in many different ways. And this war has been instigated by two of Congo's neighbors, Rwanda and Uganda, who are actually US and British allies on the so-called war on terror. What does that actually mean? Rwandan soldiers have actually done military operations for the benefit of the United States and France on the African continent and abroad. Rwandan soldiers were in Haiti, part of the UN missions. They were in Mali. They were in Central African Republic. Just lately, Rwandan soldiers are in Mozambique, where the European Union, just last year, gave Rwanda $20 million for military aid, some of which will be used for the military operation in Mozambique. But what is happening in Mozambique, right? They're telling us that we have jihadists. That's not what we have. What we do have is that we have Total, a French oil company, that it has access to one of the vast reserves of methane gas and oil there. And Rwandan soldiers are protecting those interests. So because of the interest that Rwanda, and be it even Uganda, with the Ugandan troops being in Iraq, being in Afghanistan, the UK government trying to move refugees from the UK to Rwanda and paying Rwanda £150 million for that service. Because of how the West benefits, no matter what Rwanda and Uganda do in the DRC, they don't hold them accountable. Sometimes I even have said that Rwanda is the Israel of Africa. No matter what he does in the Congo, no matter what invasions he commits, no matter what support he provides to militia group, with evidence that exists, nothing is done to them. So that's our own geopolitical sense. For African leaders, many African leaders are sometimes confused about the situation in the Congo. On one hand, you have Tony Blair, who has presented Paul Kagame as a great leader for the African continent. Bill Clinton presenting Museveni and Kagame as the Renaissance leaders of Africa. So they look at these leaders as people who are actually transforming the African continent. We should be worried of that, right? Because Sekou Touré told us in some of his speeches, right, Sekou Touré of Guinea, that whenever Western nations are praising African leaders, we should know that they have betrayed the people. Because they can't praise them for their work, because most of the time, some of the African leaders are actually affecting the situation of the people. So we finding ourselves with African leaders who are misinformed around the conflict in the Congo, where they think it's an ethnic conflict, where they think it's Congolese killing each other, when we don't make the weapons, we don't manufacture the weapons, or it can be an ethnic conflict because we have over 400 ethnic groups. So which tribe is fighting whom? So we know it's a war of aggression. And through that war, our resources are leaving the Congo at a very cheap price, a penny on the dollar, and finding its way on the world market. So that's actually the system. But the freedom of the Congo is tied to what Kwame Nkrumah said in Challenge of the Congo. Kwame Nkrumah understood that the challenge of the Congo is both internal and external. Congolese are fighting on the inside. That's why millions have died. They're not dying just waiting, right? They're resisting as well. But he understood that Congolese, as they fight their internal challenges, it will be hard for them to deal with the World Bank and the IMF in Washington, D.C., with the U.S. providing military support to neighboring countries. That is always called for international solidarity for the Congolese struggle. Today, in 2024, that call of Nkrumah, of being at the side of the Congolese, of building a United States of Africa with a capital in Kinshasa, is much more urgent today than before, because we're really at a crossroad in Africa. And that crossroad that we are actually looking at in Africa is between the win of Pan-Africanist will, left Pan-Africanist will for transformation. And we are seeing that in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Senegal, where the people of that area have been able to organize, some to military means, others to so-called democratic processes, that they all are transforming the country and saying, if Senegal is free, we have to tie it to the liberation of Africa. That's what Diomaye Faye of Senegal has said. This is the same thing as the leaders of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have said. So the movement, the new revival of left Pan-Africanism on the continent has to be connected to the liberation of the DRC. Because if Congo is not free, it will make it hard for Africa to advance based on its size, second largest African country by size, fourth largest African country by population, endowed with mineral resources estimated at $24 trillion, where Kwame Nkrumah knew that would be the engine for the transformation of Africa. So with the revival of Pan-Africanism today, the call for the liberation of Congo is very important for people to join us in solidarity to stop the carnage, stop the killing, stop the genocide of the Congolese people.
Well, I'm glad you spoke to that, the Pan-African issue, and especially the issue of sort of the rollback of French neocolonialism. And the final thing I want to ask you here in relationship to that in the last few minutes is the recent trip by President Felix Tshisekedi to France. There was a viral video, of course, of him saying something about China-Africa relations, and I have to say I found it a bit ironic because the whole trip was him really inviting France to come in an even greater way to exploit the Congo. So I was hoping you could just talk about that a little bit because I felt that side of the trip, didn't really make it onto the viral social media clips.
It did. And Africa is dealing with a lot of contradictions right now, especially around our leaders, right? Where we have African leaders who don't represent the will of the people, who are trying to posture themselves as independent decision makers, not for the benefit of the masses, but for the benefit of the elite of the country. On one hand, that sounds great. African leaders are standing up to Western nations, so let's make sure we support that will. But it does not represent the will of the Congolese people. His visit in France is very telling. On May 1st, May Day, right? On May Day, where we are celebrating workers around the world, the Congolese president was meeting with the military school, the War College in France, to strengthen military collaboration between the DRC and France. While Western African countries, right? West African countries such as Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have told the United States to leave, have told France to leave. So when France and the United States are being kicked out of West Africa, they need a place to go. They chief leaders, right, the leaders that they support, are inviting them back in the country. And that's not the interest of the Congolese people. How do I know that? Because the Congolese, during this year, during the protests, right, against the M23, young Congolese went into the French embassy and burned the French flag and said that the French are supporting Rwanda, supporting rebels in the Congo, killing Congolese. Congolese went in front of the U.S. embassy and burned the U.S. flag, saying the same. Went to the British embassy and burned the British flag. Went to the EU representation in Kinshasa and burned the EU flag because they say the hypocrisy of the West supporting Rwanda and Uganda in the invasions of the Congo, we should denounce it. But now our president is going to sign that. It's complete contradiction to where the people are actually at the moment. But what actually gives me even much hope is that I am clear that the Congolese people are not in support of the regime. I'm clear that the Congolese people have shown the world where they stand as it relates to France, as it relates to the United States, the EU, and the UK, and even Belgium, if I may say, and that they are saying that in our struggle to liberate ourselves, we need you to lift up our voices wherever you are, to tell the people we are resisting and call out the negative forces, external forces, making it harder for us on the inside to transform our country.
Well, as always, Kambale, we really appreciate you joining and helping us sort through all of this and illuminate a lot of what is not known to many. Again, Kambale Musavuli is an analyst with the Center for Research on Congo, Kinshasa. Thanks so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you always. See you next time.
Rania?
Well, I always, love Kambale coming on and breaking that down for everyone, because Congo is probably it's probably one of the most important places in the world in terms of how it makes every day of our lives function. And we never hear about it.
That's true.
It's just wild.
Well, I see we already have our next guest here, so I'm behind the
Hello,
eight ball,
Tings.
as it were. But we want to move to another crucial geopolitical issue, and that is President Xi's actually ongoing, I think he's still there, trip to Europe and France, Serbia, and Hungary. He's in Hungary today, I believe. Hopefully I'm not behind on that one. But as always, very, very happy to be joined here by Tings Chak, who's a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute and a member of the Dongsheng News Collective. Tings, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Eugene. Hi, Rania.
Well, let's just jump right into it. I guess maybe I'll just ask you initially, how do you see the importance of the tour by President Xi in Europe? Of course, in the U.S., what people watching this are getting is that it's some sort of sinister attempt to destroy U.S.-EU unity. Obviously, the Chinese side is presenting it very differently in terms of relations between China and the EU. But anyway, before I editorialize too much here, I just want to ask your thoughts on the significance of this trip.
Yeah, sure. This is the second visit of President Xi to Europe in the last 5 years, and it's actually his first visit overseas this year. So it does reflect some kind of importance, especially the priority that China is placing on its relationship with Europe, and of course with France being a major player in that relationship. Just for you to get a sense, France is actually tied with the U.S. as the most state visits by Xi, with 5 times each, and only next to Russia, which is 9 times. And of course, this trip is marked by several important anniversaries. The first is the 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations between France and China, 75 years with Hungary, and also 25 years since the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. But maybe we can talk about that separately. But I think what's interesting, and even how you asked the question, is that somehow the trip is being framed as really about the U.S., or China's attempt to drive a wedge, as you said. I think that the fact that U.S. sort of places itself in the middle of the China-Europe relations is very indicative of the crisis we're seeing in Europe. Because at the end of it, why should the U.S. be in the equation at all? Why aren't we just talking about what Europe needs or wants, or what is in the interest of the European people? Right now, Europe is rife with all kinds of problems. We're seeing stagnating economies, especially with the largest economies like Germany and Russia going into recession. We're seeing energy crisis, partly shooting itself in the foot after the EU cut off Russian gas for its own people. We see people who are angry, farmers' protests, workers' strikes, like student protests. And it seems like the far right is the only force that's really rising in tide with the anger of the people. So amidst of all these questions, I think Europe has a lot of questions to ask itself about how it wants to pursue the relationship with China. Does it want to continue down this path? You remember in 2019, the EU officially adopted a position that put China as a so-called partner, competitor, and systemic rival, which I always found a little bit confusing. But in reality, I think the EU actually needs China, perhaps even more than China needs the EU. And in some ways, I think, especially highlighted by the visit in France, Macron took Xi to his beloved Pyrenees Mountains as a kind of warm gesture of, sort of relations between the two countries. But I think the question for me is really, is France or is Europe really ready to escape this sort of blame game that it's been part of, I think, led by the US around the big bad China? And is it ready to develop and propose an independent path and independent set of relations with China that's in the interest of its own people and not necessarily dictated by what the US wants? And I think that still remains to be seen.
Tings, how can we understand this visit in the context of France's Macron changing or having this kind of contradictory position when it comes to China?
Yeah, I mean, I think Macron has been quite interesting. I mean, if we've observed his changes in recent years, right? I think in the last year on foreign policy issues has become increasingly hawkish, especially concerning Russia and Ukraine. And I think in the very beginning, when the war broke out, France, Macron was taking a line of more, we need diplomatic or we need a peaceful solution, we need to have a political solution. And then up until recently, I think as recent as February, Macron was making these bombastic claims of, that they wouldn't omit the possibility of putting French troops in Ukraine, which was quite bold, right? It was trying to definitely show a strong stance wherever that was leading him. But what's interesting is that I think it coincides with his visit first to China and then subsequently with Xi's visit to France, some shifting tones. One thing we're hearing Macron say much more is instead of talking about the strategic rival that is China, but moving towards strategic autonomy for Europe and for France, and not wanting to, and I'm quoting him, to be America's followers. And some things I just want to bring some of the quotes of his in recent times that I think are worthwhile to note. When he came back from China on the equivalent of the Air Force Ones of France, he said, Europe must reduce its dependency on the United States and avoid getting dragged into the confrontation with China and the US over Taiwan. And then shortly after, he was talking about a very kind of somber look at the state of Europe. He said, our Europe today is mortal and it can die. And we have to actually show ourselves not to be a vassal of the United States. And then later on, after Xi's visit, very interestingly, Macron goes and says, we have no desire to be at war with Russia or the Russian people. We don't want a regime change in Moscow. And now more than ever, France wants to strengthen cooperation with China because it bears on the future of Europe. So I think some of these things are worthwhile to note. We don't know exactly where this is going to take, how much they're willing to kind of move forward to a position of strategic autonomy, as they're calling it, and build more cooperation with China. Because at the end of the day, Macron still feels the need to say, well, when push comes to shove, we still prefer the U.S. as our ally.
It'll be interesting to see it develop for sure. And, one of the things we mentioned, or you mentioned earlier, is the poignancy of the trip to Serbia, given this being the 25th anniversary of the bombing of the Chinese embassy in what was then actually Yugoslavia, but in Belgrade, now the capital of Serbia. And I'm just curious some of your thoughts around that. And you're based in China, so I'm also curious perhaps some of the reaction to that leg of the trip amongst Chinese people, because obviously it's a very, very evocative issue.
Yeah, I mean, definitely this is a very politically significant date for President Xi to visit. I mean, he chose May 7th, which is the 25th year since the bombing. And I think it's quite important because despite the fact that NATO has always said that it was an accident, China and the Chinese people have never accepted that response. And it was made quite clearly in a letter that Xi wrote and was published in a Serbian outlet called Politika. And he said that 25 years ago today, NATO flagrantly bombed the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia. And this we should never forget. The Chinese people cherish peace, and we would never allow such tragic history to repeat itself. So clearly that was a strong political statement to say, condemning actually NATO aggressions, which I think in this moment is not a not so subtle criticism of NATO as well, bringing in this historical legacy as well. So I think the fact that Xi made a visit to Serbia as one of his three countries on his European leg is very symbolic politically, but also has huge resonance for the Chinese people who remember this bombing deeply till today. as well as, the strengthening of relations between the two countries. Serbia, though not a EU member, it's a candidate member, but is an important player in the European scene, especially around having good relations with China. They just, for example, elevated their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partner, which is the only country in the Central or Eastern Europe to have that. So it's definitely signaling towards being a stronger European partner in the years to come.
And then, Tings, as is often the case throughout this visit, we had the issue of fair competition that was often brought up by various European officials, including one of our all-time favorites, Ursula von der Leyen, comes from lineage of plantation owners and Nazis. Always have to mention that. Hey. But she happened to be hanging around France, and we heard that we hear that terminology a lot from the Americans, hearing it from this sort of like European Atlanticists, the fair competition, right? And this is, of course, for those who don't know, it's a nod to this Western critique of Chinese overcapacity in terms of economic production. Chinese overcapacity. But what can we make of this claim about fair competition, which is being widely used to suggest that China's not playing fair economically?
I mean, it's quite hilarious, right? Because for decades, we just accept the fact that the Volkswagens or the Fords and all the cars from Europe and US manufacturers are on the streets. And that's just a given. That's just the status quo we should always accept, right? Like there was never a European or American overcapacity issue in our countries. But the moment that we start producing these things, especially when we move up the value chain and start producing cars, electric vehicles, or cell phones, then that becomes a problem of overcapacity. So I think that's always interesting when it becomes a problem and when it isn't a problem and should just be maintained and imposed on our countries easily. But I think one of the things that's just easy to use China as a scapegoat, right? To project, I think, some of the problems I mentioned already in Europe or in the US, these internal conflicts, and just project it on an external rival, right? And so it's important to blame China instead of actually addressing the real questions of the decline in Europe's competitiveness or the US competitiveness, or actually real questions of production and the real economy that are not being resolved in the respective countries. It's easier to blame China's overcapacity problem. But at the same time, I think there's sometimes confusions about what is it that Europe wants or a country like France wants. At some point, it's like, oh yeah, we do like the Chinese EVs because they are cheaper and they're well produced. But then we also want to increase tariffs on these imported cars because, they're being subsidized by the government or something like that. But then they want to keep the Chinese cars out. But at the same time, they're fighting amongst each other to build Chinese factories of these EV factories, for example. For example, this time coming out of this meeting is the first BYD, which is a Chinese electric vehicle company, is going to start producing creating its own factory in Hungary, which is the first European factory it's going to have. So they've been competing to try to attract these factories, but at the same time, they want to keep the cars out. So at the same time, they have to make up their own minds. And I think one of the other things I just wanted to point out, it's kind of deviating a little bit, but I think it's just, it's such an easy sort of fix to blame China and have these sort of Western criticisms. And I think one thing I wanted to note that I think media didn't cover very much of is what Xi Jinping said, and used this platform in France to talk about actually making his own criticism of what needs to be truly criticized, which is the question of Gaza, question of Palestine. So Xi Jinping used this platform to talk about, again, very consistent line, the necessity to immediately have a sustainable ceasefire, Palestine's full membership in the UN, statehood, and all these things that I think China has been quite clear on. So I think that, in a way, is a focus that he wanted to draw our attention to instead of this sort of, kind of stuff about problems of overcapacity and whatnot.
No, I think it's a good point. The New York Times, just a couple of days ago, and, the New York Times is almost always publishing negative things about China, said themselves that there is little sign of any surge of cheap Chinese products in the official trade data. So even the New York Times saying this is totally fake and totally false in every way. But I think you're right. Easy to scapegoat China. And quite frankly, And I think you probably agree with this, Tinks. The element of racism makes it even easier, in the context of the American mind. But as always, we really appreciate the opportunity to have you on. Everyone who's not following the Dongsheng News Collective or Tricontinental, I don't know what you're doing. You're obviously not paying close attention to Breakthrough News, but you need to start paying attention to them because they have excellent folks working for them, like Tinks, who's a researcher with both organizations. But thanks so much for giving us some of your time and staying up very late for us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Rania?
I mean, I just feel like it's unfair that China is looks better than we do right now. It's just so unfair. That's kind of what they sound like. They sound like a jealous teenage girl.
Well, it's totally ridiculous too because one, I looked this up. I think in the top 20 EV makers in America selling them last year, none of them are Chinese. I don't even think you can buy a Chinese electric vehicle in America. But on top of that, the U.S. is massively subsidizing EVs and battery technology and chips and all these other things, and that they say it's so bad for China to do. Well, in the Inflation Reduction Act, they're spending billions of dollars doing this. And also there's sort of the backdoor subsidy at the state level and at the federal level, which are the tax breaks you get for buying hybrids and buying electric vehicles. That's essentially a subsidy. The reason why a Tesla, for instance, is within reach of the average consumer now is because you can add it in. In fact, even when you see the commercials for Tesla, they'll say with tax breaks, it's XYZ amount of money. So there's, pot calling the kettle black in that context. And of course, this is, and I'll just sort of close and transition here, a good point that a friend of the show, Grief Chelwa, made recently. He wrote an article, check him out. I put it on my personal social media about the IMF in Africa and about how the IMF says, African countries shouldn't pursue industrial policy. But he makes the point that every advanced country, of course, had an industrial policy with heavy subsidies, significant state ownership, and so on and so forth. So it's not that they shouldn't have an industrial policy, it's that these sort of Western countries and the club of handful of other countries, Japan and South Korea, want to keep anyone else out of that rich country club by saying, don't copy us because it doesn't work, which is bizarre because it did. But it just shows that a lot of, I think, the hatred against China and other countries for their industrial policies are just that. The fact that they do not want to open up the doors to more potential competition and more countries that could challenge U.S. brands that have a monopoly in cars, U.S., Japanese, German, that have a monopoly over the market that gives more choice to consumers so that the prices ultimately will come down. But they don't want that. They want to be able to collude and to, make you pay more money and so on and so forth. It's just more of this, everything all the accusations are just projection. Yeah. There's unfair competition. It's actually, no, you're the ones who rigged the rules. And then say you're allowed to do things that other people aren't allowed to do because it doesn't benefit you if they do them. It's just, it's so obvious, but unfortunately, these kinds of phrases like unfair competition end up getting adopted by everybody that people just start to absorb them and think they're accurate even when they're not. Yeah, no, very true, very true. Well, speaking of accuracy and lack thereof in the mainstream media and certainly amongst the politicians of America, the student encampments that have been sweeping the entire nation, now the entire globe, by the way, I think it's in the Netherlands right now. There's a major conflict between students and the police worth looking into there. I can't remember exactly where it is. I think it is in the Netherlands. Either way, long story short, you can see that there's a huge amount of misinformation being driven by President Joe Biden and the White House, claiming this is some massive anti-Semitic surge. But we know that is not the case, and we know very well on Breakthrough News because our very own Kay Pritzker was embedded at Columbia University for just about the entire occupation and was able to get a number of fantastic moments there, and of course has been to some of the other campuses around the region where these encampments have been taking place. So we want to bring Kay Pritzker, journalist with Breakthrough News, on here to discuss this a little bit more. Kay, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you here, sir. It's an honor to have you here. Well, I guess, Kay, my first question for you is sort of this. I mean, who were these people at Columbia, and what do you think it says about the overall mainstream narrative about what was going on in the campuses?
Yeah, it was really shocking to read the encampment because I wasn't really, focused on the news or anything like that. And when I left the encampment, I saw all of what the media is saying, and it was just crazy, all these claims that people were being violent or that they were.
Kay, give me 1 second. Hold on, let me cut in on you there. We're having some audio problems with you. We're gonna take you off and see if we can fix this and bring you back because we want to get this as critically important work. And of course, the live streams that we were doing for weeks, you can of course still see here at our YouTube page where you are right now. Don't go right now, but if you go, I mean, maybe like, I don't know, Kay must have gotten 100 hours worth of footage. I mean, it really was amazing to see. And just showing that it's not, what it says it was. So we'll bring him back and speak more to that issue. We're going to definitely work on that audio. I'm just monitoring that when we have Kay back. But yeah, to swing back around to the point you were making, Rania, there's so much projection on the world stage by the United States. And this in a way feels like another issue, sort of like this is the most democratic country in the world. And then, you've got these pictures coming out of cops dragging, women by their hair or whatever on campuses. There was the professor that was like, he just like asked, like, why are you doing this? And they beat him up. It really is an amazing factor. We see this in New York City, of course, where protesters are being constantly arrested for nothing, really. Yeah. And exercising their free speech rights. And it's funny because Biden was saying how, it can't be, you can exercise your right to free speech, but it can't be disruptive. As if like all of the, some people might not like this analogy, but what about the Boston Tea Party? You say you love America. That was deeply disruptive.
Quite disruptive, yeah.
The civil rights movement, they were sometimes practicing Gandhian nonviolence, but they were deliberately actually trying to disrupt the flow of commerce by marching on streets, sit-ins, as you said, other ways of trying to, disrupt the status quo. The very basis of free speech, from my point of view in the American context, if you believe the hype about it, what it's supposed to be in its own, self-pronouncements, is actually to be disruptive.
Well, it's also the fact that why would somebody protest to not disrupt? Like, that would totally defeat the purpose.
Excuse me, sir. Excuse me. Can I have more porridge?
Like, it's just so absurd, the idea that, like, protest is fine as long as it doesn't bother anyone. Otherwise, like, could you imagine if that was the attitude during segregation? If they were like, we just don't want to bother everybody, but we really want segregation to end. It's so insane. Like, it's just true. It's just when you actually think about it, it's so absurd.
It is.
It's just a talking point to use to like make what everybody's doing seem ridiculous and like petty or something, when in fact they are supporting a genocide, and we need to make people uncomfortable about that. That's just the way it works in the midst of a genocide, just like segregation. Got to make people who aren't feeling it be a little uncomfortable about it so they understand and learn what's happening. And also, the only way the disruption stops is if the injustice stops.
Yes.
That's the whole point.
Well, we've got Kay Pritzker back here. Let's bring him back in. Kay Pritzker joins us. Kay, welcome back.
Hey, good to be back. I hope this is all right.
I don't know.
It seems like it might be the same.
What's with that audio, Kay?
I think we might be being sabotaged by Unit 8802.
I feel like at this point the computer audio would just be better if he's like using some special mic that just isn't working.
Well, we'll figure that out. We'll work on that. We have a high technical team here, so we're always prepared for any eventuality.
Can I just throw one thing out about this whole like attitude towards protests? There's also the disruptive act of like tear gassing and firing rubber bullets at students. It's utterly shocking. Had this happened in like any other country that America hates, imagine 2,500 students
If this
arrested.
was Iran, this would be like 24 hours a day on the mainstream media about how Iran is so anti-democratic and a dictatorship and this, that, and the
and it's
third.
about to fall. The regime is about to fall.
Yeah, of course. They would definitely be like, America is on the verge of falling.
Yeah.
They would be talking about how Biden is about to lose the election because of this.
Well, that's true.
Yeah, that's true. But they're not really saying it in that regard.
It's actually insane. Like, I just can't even understand the thinking of a campaign that desperately needs young people to come out and vote, being like, you know what? Tear gas the students. That's our get out the vote this year. Like, force them to vote via barrel of a gun.
Well, and then you had a guy in Colombia, one of these cops, sort of, a Cheddar Bob type individual whose gun went off, quote unquote, by accident.
Oh, I missed that.
And thank God no one was injured. But you're just thinking, like, what are these people even doing? And of course, it's all then they're being lauded by the mayor of New York City, by these other individuals. And Biden, I think, to me, Biden is pouring gas on the fire, by saying that this is the largest surge of anti-Semitism ever, or whatever he's saying, which is just, and there's so many different elements to that, but I think we do have Kay back with us now.
Third time's the charm.
It is. Kay.
Is the third time the charm?
Yes!
Yes.
We can hear you.
Touchdown.
Wow.
Kay, you were saying, as it regards what you witnessed in Colombia, who was really there, and how that doesn't jibe with what the mainstream was saying.
Yeah, so right. So the media has been saying all this about how the people are violent, whatever, anti-Semitic. They also said it's like astroturf. They say like, oh, the people, they must be getting paid or something. Like, how are all these students camping out? And I think that really is like one of the most amazing parts of this story is this encampment was put together all through volunteer labor. Like, it was absolutely amazing. And the only way to really describe it is it was like an actual society or community. The population of the encampment was larger than some small towns in America, and they not only fed everyone, they had so much food actually that they were giving the food to the other encampments as well as to food pantries in Harlem, which was amazing. They had everyone in tents, housed with blankets. But they also had a 24/7 security detail. They had a whole school curricula, in the vein of education and being at Columbia University. They decided to put on their own People's University where they would teach classes about all the people's struggles around the world, not just about Palestine. And they tie it back to what was happening in Gaza. But these were all students doing this. Like, these were all students who were taking time out of their day. I'm sure thousands of hours volunteered to basically take up like any role that needed to be taken up. People would just fill the spot in. And I spoke to some students. I talked to one student who came down after the first encampment was shut down. They had arrested all the protesters, and the second encampment was forming on the second lawn. And she said, when I saw those arrests happen, I was so moved by what was happening. I just went down to the second encampment, and what in her words, she said she begged them. She was like, please give me a role. And they told her, hey, you can help with food distribution. I saw her there every single day. And I was like, you must have class, right? Like, you must have things you need to take care of. And she said, who cares if I get a C in organic chemistry when there's a genocide happening in Palestine? This is who is putting this encampment together. I mean, it is the sense of self-sacrifice, the sense of selflessness is really the story of this movement. Of course, the media is trying to twist that because that is really what makes this movement so incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredible, like you said, but then also what else was incredible, Kay, was the vicious response by essentially the state to what you just described. And so why don't you were there when the police came and basically brutally, violently cleared out this encampment and arrested so many students. Can you walk us through what happened?
Yeah, I mean, so for people that have been following the story, there were actually two encampments. There was the first encampment, which was called on, there are two lawns that are parallel to one another. First one was shut down and by the NYPD. And this is really what sparked the nationwide, the worldwide encampment movement. And then, there was the second encampment, which became Hamilton Hall, which the protesters renamed Hind Hall after Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old Palestinian girl who was murdered by Israel. And I mean, it was really, I mean, it was a crazy sight to see. There are pictures, obviously, that have circulated widely of these long lines of NYPD trucks going down 4 blocks. There, the rows of NYPD, hundreds of cops just flooding into Columbia's campus. That bear truck that they had that they used to breach the upper floors of Hind Hall. The response just goes to show how afraid the ruling class is of this movement. And, a lot of the media's discussion or narrative around this is, oh, look at these encampments. They focus very much on the surface level. Look at these tents. Look at they destroyed the lawn here, or like, oh, wow, they spray painted something on a building. And it's like, that's really, it's not tents that the ruling class fears. It's not because of tents that every city in America is coordinating a massive SWAT-like, police state-like response to crush these encampments. It's because these people aren't going away. Every time they crush an encampment, 5 new ones pop up. The day after they crushed the Colombia encampment, I think there was one in in Spain or maybe somewhere else, Tokyo. I mean, these encampments are popping up everywhere, and this is precisely why I think this whole strategy. It reminds me of exactly why Israel will never win in Gaza, or why the U.S. lost in Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam or Korea is the police, the imperialists, all these people, they think, oh, well, if we just crush this movement, if we have superior force, or, if we show superior brutality, these people will just go away. But, the Columbia students have vowed that this is just the beginning. They're vowing to come back. They're holding even more protests, and it'll be the same thing with all these encampments around the country. They're just going to keep popping up all over the place, and you can't really beat a movement like that. The genie has come out of the bottle, so to speak, and all these students who are protesting, they can't unsee what they've seen in Gaza. They will never forget which administrators called the cops on them, or which police official called them terrorists or called them anti-Semites or what have you. They'll never forget these things. And this is what's motivating them. And that's what the police and, the politicians don't understand is they're not motivated by job prospects. They're not motivated by, advancing their careers. They're motivated by Gaza, and they're motivated by ending this genocide. And, you'll only continue to see these encampments popping up everywhere.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that bear truck. I mean, in and of itself, sort of theater. It reminded, it's like it was like a hostage situation where someone had 100 people hostage, and then they made a movie about it, a little sort of slick-looking thing from the NYPD. But, that being said, Kay, I think the other aspect of this that you've spoken to some degree, but I think is important is these aren't really like random places. It's not like they were like, let's protest on campus as opposed to Times Square, but it's also exposing the deep complicity of basically the entirety of American higher education in the genocide and apartheid.
Yeah, I think that's something that's so interesting is when Columbia, launched this encampment and all these other campuses followed suit, like the fact that all these other colleges and universities also have their own investments in Israeli apartheid, in Israeli genocide, just goes to show how deeply, wedded the U.S.-Israel relationship is in all institutions in our country. And, these are the institutions that we're taught to respect the most. Places like Columbia University, our higher education, we're taught to see them as the most respectable, institutions in our society. And they have their hands fully, they're knee deep in genocide. So, I think the movement to sort of the encampment movement, it's not a random thing. It's not students just, they're upset or, they're angsty, like the media's been framing it. Oh, they're just, these angsty teens. No, they're actually targeting these multi-billion-dollar endowments that these universities hold, these investment vehicles, which are invested in Lockheed Martin. They're invested in Microsoft and Amazon and all these tech companies that are supporting Israeli apartheid. And, this is actually, they're following the call of Palestinian society of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which has called on people around the world to support, to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel and all institutions that support the Israeli genocide. And certainly these universities are among them. It's not just their endowments. They also have academic ties to many Israeli universities. Columbia University, for one, has a satellite campus in Tel Aviv. And, a lot of these other campuses have exchange programs, all this. And all these things sort of, the reason, you might be asking, oh, well, why are they calling for the closure of a campus? And the reason is, to go about our lives as usual, or to just treat Israel like it's another country, like it's just another, place that we can interact with and just treat normally while they're committing a genocide in Gaza, is exactly the type of mentality that has allowed this genocide to go on for so long. What's happening in Gaza is exceptional. There's nothing normal about this, and they should not be treated as a normal country. They are a pariah country, and anyone that does business with them, anyone that treats them as a normal business partner, as a partner in academic, relations, should be called out and should be ostracized and should be isolated for essentially normalizing this genocide.
Well, I want to ask you to respond to, and it seems silly to respond to it because it's such a ridiculous claim. Just throwing out my personal opinion on that, and I know a lot of people will agree with me, but it is gaining traction. It's always gained traction, this ability to weaponize the idea of anti-Semitism, right? You saw the entire mainstream corporate media apparatus in line with all these U.S. politicians who were against these protests, almost like in unison, accusing these protesters of making Jewish students on campus feel unsafe, accusing them in some like really insane cases of saying what's happening on U.S. campuses is tantamount to what happened during, ahead of the Nazi Holocaust to Jewish students in Nazi Germany. But really, you've got CNN doing these insane segments, especially after what happened at UCLA with Dana Bash, going with that, saying Jewish students are not safe on campuses. There's an anti-Semitism crisis. And you have them using this to try to get definitions of anti-Semitism passed that actually are about taking, basically making it punishable to criticize Israel, and on and on and on. So as all that, that storm was happening around these campus protests, what were you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, it really just shows how desperate these people are getting, that they're drawing these ridiculous comparisons to, universities in Nazi Germany. I mean, I think it's funny because it was almost impossible to look around the Colombian encampment without seeing a kippah, without seeing someone wearing, it was actually palpable. I was shocked. I mean, we're at protests all the time, all the time. We see Jews supporting Palestine all the time. I was shocked by how many Jewish students were at this encampment. Funny enough, the Colombian encampment coincided with Passover, and the Jewish students there that were celebrating, it was a very intentional part of their celebration this year to say that we are celebrating, or we are commemorating rather, the exodus of Jews from Egypt, of the history of the persecution of the Jewish people. We from these lessons, we draw the fact that all human beings have a place in this world, that anyone facing genocide or discrimination should be protected, and as Jews we should speak out for them. And it's honestly, it's funny to see all these accusations that Jews aren't safe on these campuses, because the the pro-Israeli students on Columbia's campus, they would come out every single night, and they would they would have these rallies. They were small rallies, but they would try to instigate like a fight with the encampment. They would come in, they'd wave Israeli flags, they'd play the American national anthem every single night. And it's they would try to start fights with people, and they would mostly just get ignored. I don't think anyone really cared, because, we were just sitting there, eating dinner, playing guitar or whatever, singing songs. But, it's completely the opposite. I mean, at least at Columbia, there was also that professor, the Zionist professor, Shai Davidai. All these people are trying to make a scene. They were trying to instigate, really. So it was completely the opposite. They were trying to, make it seem like they were being excluded. They were actually allowed to enter our camp. And there were Zionist students that were walking around our camp, filming, trying to argue with people. And, people just ignored them. I mean, I don't think anyone really cared that they were there.
No, I think that's actually a crucial question. I mean, it's honestly amazing. And what happened at UCLA, the only violence I've actually seen in this context has been against the encampments, not them against anyone else. But, there's a difference between uncomfortable and unsafe. But nonetheless, really important work. And I think that a lot of it, of course, is still available on our website. Kay Pritzker was embedded there in Columbia, also as at a few other universities. But as always, Kay Pritzker, journalist with Breakthrough News, great outlet. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Bye, guys.
Great outlet. Really, that Breakthrough News. Speaking of.
Glad you agree.
Speaking of, for those who are watching, I see we've got over 1,000 watching, which is fantastic, but we don't have over 1,000 likes on the episode yet, Eugene. So
what does that mean?
I want to encourage, I should use a soft approach first. So I want to encourage those who are watching to make sure you smash that like button. Super important to help boost us in the algorithm, because we're not CNN, so we don't get automatically shoved down everybody's faces in America. Make sure you smash that like button. And also just a reminder, we have been doing on-the-ground reporting at campuses across the country. Kay has been tireless in that effort. So has our other correspondent, Rachel. She's been fantastic. So this is a really more important moment where there's a massive uprising across the country, and we're bringing you what's actually happening on the ground. So support independent media, support Breakthrough News. Go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News so that we can keep bringing you this sort of coverage.
Yeah, it's funny. I was watching something on CBS the other day. Well, several different times. That's why it's burned into my memory. Nora O'Donnell, has this commercial for her show on CBS. And, yeah, there's so much you could say about it, but the only it's like scenes of her and her various different, reporting trips.
Okay.
The only thing that is related to Israel-Palestine is her in Israel when there's some sort of rocket attack or whatever, and she's running to the shelter, and it's just so tone deaf because it's we take you to the places where no one is, and I'm just are you kidding me? Gaza's being completely leveled, and here you are. But it just is so indicative of how what you're saying about the importance of alternative media and how these people, obviously, CBS, it's on their network, so of course they can pay for their own things, but this is America's most watched network, and this is the type of program that's considered to be their prestige news show that's allegedly showing you the real thing that's going. There's not even a clip of Gaza.
Yeah.
I know she hasn't been there, but there's not even a clip of Gaza. It's just her running to some Israeli shelter, which of course helps build the narrative that Israelis are as victimized. It reminds me of Ted Cruz, and this is I think in the 2021 war, and Gaza's been massively attacked, and he goes to some person's living room that's kind of been a little bit bombed, and he's can you believe what they've done? And it's this false equivalence. But anyway, it's subtle, and you might not notice it, but when I'd seen the commercial 8 times, it started to really stand out to me how those subtle things really start to seep into your memory. But
They absolutely do.
since we're talking about misinformation and disinformation and the mainstream media covering stories terribly, we want to turn to Haiti, which has to be one of the worst covered countries in the U.S. media, unfortunately, even though it gets a lot of sensationalistic coverage when major things happening, but a lot of things happening there right now. And we want to get you up to speed with the correct context of what's happening in Haiti as a potential invasion looms there, and maybe not potential anymore. Very happy to be joined once again on the show by Dr. Jemima Pierre, who's a professor of global race at the Institute for Race, Gender, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia, and also, very importantly, a member of the Black Alliance for Peace. Jemima, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I want to start here with this transitional council, which is, being much discussed in the U.S. media as, turning the page, Haiti getting a new government, the implication being that it's a representative one that will start to, do good things. Who is this transitional council and what's their mandate?
Right. Well, let's just begin by saying Haiti's under occupation, has been under occupation for a very long time, since the U.S. removed our elected president in 2004. This presidential council is just a continuation of the same thing, because what's happened is, once Ariel Henry was not allowed to return back to the country, and that's also under speculation as to whether or not the U.S. planned this, or whether or not it was really the armed groups that prevented him from coming back into the country. The U.S. decided to put in a plan to basically, their whole goal is to say free and fair elections, because they keep saying that as if elections under certain terms, under these terms, actually are free and fair. But this presidential council was handpicked by the U.S. The participants of the presidential council was handpicked by the U.S. using the CARICOM, the Caribbean countries, in particular, Mia Mottley and Ershon Ali. Mia Mottley is the Prime Minister of Barbados. Ershon Ali was the President of Guyana. And so they handpicked these people to be part of the presidential council. The participants who were already handpicked had to actually agree that the first thing that they would sign on to would be an international intervention into Haiti. So in order to be at the table to discuss Haiti's future, you had to agree to the terms of the U.S. And the CARICOM leaders were very much the ones, I think, work as overseers on this plantation that we call the Caribbean. They work as overseers because they're the ones that forced that. And so they became the people running the discussion, even though Anthony Blinken was in the room, France, which has no business being on this side of the Atlantic. France was in the room, Canada was in the room, Mexico was in the room, and Brazil was part of these negotiations. And so what you had is on March 11th, they had these negotiations to create this presidential council. The CARICOM and US and core group members met secretly without any Haitian representatives. And then after they handpicked the representatives, they brought them in for the negotiations. And so from the very beginning, this 7-member or 9-member presidential council is unconstitutional. But then again, there hasn't been anything constitutional in Haiti since 2004. And so they created this 9-member presidential council that they handpicked that agreed to foreign invasion. And it's not a democratically elected group. It's not as if you went through the country and decided to pick who would be participating in Conversation 80. It's also the same old political class, right? Including members of the PHDK Ariel Henry's party, including the Lavalas party. So there are all these same old politicians that they chose to do this. And so now, of course, what it makes sense is that there have been infighting within the presidential council, but what they did do was follow through with what they were supposed to do, basically call Kenya to send in the force, which is really the U.S. And so what's happening now, I don't know if I can keep going just yet, but the reality is, for the past 2-3 days, the U.S. military planes have been landing in Haiti. There have been 9 military planes landing in Haiti. Mind you, everybody thinks Haiti's in a civil war. Nobody can fly in and out. But the U.S., so this is supposedly a sovereign country, but you have the U.S. military planes, and they're saying they're expecting about 100 more of these. So the U.S. has already awarded contracts for police advisors for this invasion. They're about to build a base for the military invasion. So they're coming in. And so part of that is you have to ask yourself, this presidential council was set up to give it a veneer of legality to come in and basically say this is a Haitian-led solution. When the truth is a CARICOM plan, but CARICOM is a neo-colonial power that's doing the bidding of the U.S. It's a terrible mess. I feel like we're in a worse position now than we were, right after the coup d'etat in 2004.
Wow. I'm curious, the reasoning you'll see given for this invasion, why it's so necessary is because law and order has broken down in Haiti. There's just, all these criminal gang elements that have taken over. No one has control. There's political instability. We know this is not actually what the U.S. or its allies care about. So what's the actual reason for doing this?
The U.S. is militarizing the Caribbean, and they're doing that in preparation for whatever war they're planning with China and to go against Russia and China's influence in the region. And this is very important because as you obviously know, there's the problems between Guyana and Venezuela over the oil fields, the Essequibo oil fields, right? The U.S. has a huge military presence right now in Guyana because the Guyanese called in the U.S. To support. So there's that. You have Operation Trade Winds, which are military exercises that are ongoing right now, hosted by Barbados, where you have participants from all over, including from Europe, from Britain, from France, Netherlands, participating in military exercises. This is like in the U.S. so-called backyard, right? So this is like the militarization of what's going on. This military intervention was scheduled back. The U.S. has been wanting this since 2021, when Jovenel Moïse was assassinated, Haiti's former president. And what they wanted to do was to have this intervention to actually protect Ariel Henry, who was their puppet. And they wanted the intervention. They're saying it was an emergency back in 2022 when people were protesting the removal of fuel subsidies, protesting the rise in insecurity, and the importation of guns and ammunition into the country through these ports, and where the U.S. knows where they're coming from. And I think what's happening is the U.S. actually wants to has always wanted a military presence in Haiti and wants Haiti as a base. In fact, I would point you to this. We published on Black Agenda Report the Global Fragilities Act, which is the U.S. plan for control using the Department of Defense, Department of State, and USAID for its new Monroe Doctrine type policy in the region. In fact, they had a 45-page report called The U.S. Strategy to Prevent Conflict and Promote Stability, 10-Year Strategic Plan for Haiti, which they removed from the website after we started talking about it. But it was on the U.S. Embassy, U.S. State Department website. So they already have a 40, and I can send this so that you can put it under your link, because they have a 45-page plan, 10-year plan. So that means this is not about gangs. This is about U.S. establishing a permanent presence in Haiti in order for them then to maybe use the UN but to do it under the black faces of Kenyans, people from Benin, from the Caribbean, and so on. So it's a new foreign policy where you use proxies to uphold U.S. foreign policy objectives. But if this was about gangs, why would you need to bring 100 plane loads of military presence, of building a base, of doing all these things, putting out contracts to U.S. companies, and so on, in order to quell, a couple hundred people with guns? I mean, that everyone who actually has sense should know better than this.
No, I think that's a critically important point. And I think it speaks to another element of this, too. I mean, the whole sort of like, well, there is no other alternative, as if Haitians, have no ability to organize their own lives, their own popular structures. And I was hoping you could talk about that, because even in the context of, the security crisis, I was reading, I think it was in the New York Times, and they were, obviously it was a terrible article, but one of the things that they noted, they were interviewing a guy they were interviewing him because he was standing in front of his neighborhood as part of a self-organized neighborhood thing to protect their own neighborhood. So it's obvious that Haitians are throwing up elements of popular organization in this moment. It's just being ignored in terms of who is favored for leadership by the West.
Well, definitely. The reality is there's a racist trope when it comes to Haiti, that these Black people cannot rule themselves. We have to do something. So what you do is you increase the media. So you notice Haiti has not really been in the news, like the gang, you haven't heard that. You just hear now it's like this international intervention coming in. So what you do is you put stories in the media. We know the CIA is good to this, right? You put stories in the media and you have every single Western media repeating the same story over and over again. Haiti is is out of control. Meanwhile, Ecuador has a huge gang problem. Jamaica has had a state of emergency because of gang violence. Mexico has its cartels, but it's Haiti where, you have these, a small group of people who are armed, and these arms are being brought in from the U.S., right, through private ports. You have that in the Port-au-Prince region. The rest of the country seems to be okay. Things are going in. But you're telling the world that there's a civil war in Haiti and we have to do something right now or else Haiti will go into chaos. They've been saying there's an emergency. This is what the Chinese ambassador and Russian ambassador said the last time they met on Haiti. They're saying that you all have been saying it's an emergency. We have to go into Haiti since 2022. It's 2024. You haven't gone into Haiti. So they're manufacturing consent, but it's the consent works because people have this assumption that these Black people in Haiti are not able to control themselves because they have a long history of violence and so on and so forth. So the consent is easy to manufacture, right? But the reality is, as you say, even after the earthquake, it was Haitians helping each other. It was communities coming together, feeding each other, and so on. And right now, Haiti had the Wakale movement where they were catching the young armed men themselves and doing, community justice. So what Haiti needs is to be left alone and to stop the U.S. and the Department of Defense and the drug DOA, whatever drug enforcement agency, to stop dumping arms into the country, to get the elite that are sanctioned by Canada but not by the U.S. to stop funding and arming these armed groups. Haitian people can take care of themselves, but it would go against U.S. plans for the region. And now the U.S. has all these Caribbean neo-colonial governments willing to go along with it as it fully militarizes the region one more time as it prepares to go against China in the Pacific.
So I think it's really interesting to zoom out a bit because of what you're saying about the use of Haiti in this Cold War with China. Where do countries in the region stand on this issue, aside from the Caribbean nations, which you've laid that out? Where do countries is anybody opposing this in the region? Furthermore, can you elaborate a bit on what we're hearing from China and Russia on this intervention that the U.S. is leading in Haiti?
Well, to answer your second question first, China and Russia have actually been against this intervention, this call for an intervention from the very beginning. In fact, this vote has been going in front of the UN Security Council since 2022. It's only in October that they abstained. And I'm not sure why they abstained, but I think they abstained because the US was able to get the CARICOM countries, in particular Mia Mottley, to convince people that this operation needs to happen. And so China and Russia have always said that this does not seem like a viable operation. And quickly, before I talk about the Caribbean nations, I want to just let your viewers know, this is not a UN mission. This is not a UN mission. It's sanctioned by the UN Security Council, but it's not under the purview of the UN, which is why the US is paying Kenya $300 million. It's funding the CARICOM nations to do this. In fact, it was the whole point. The proposed mission is ill-considered because part of it is there's no full plan. There's a 30, which is why the Congress refused to fund it. Actually, they're saying there's a 33-page document that the White House passed for this mission that they don't even understand how they will deal with the armed groups, whether foreign troops will engage directly in the fighting. There's no timeline for success. There's no plan, right? And so this is a non-UN mission, which means that these are effective mercenaries because under what purview, right? So if they go in and they start shooting up people, who will be held responsible for the killings, right? So I want everybody to understand how, and I always say Haiti is, the laboratory for this region, because how do you get all these foreigners to come into this country under no jurisdiction to come in and say we're fighting gangs, and then they can just shoot up people? So there's that. The first part of your question is important because I've always said that the leftism of the Americas crumbled at the door of Haitian sovereignty. There are very few people who are against this military intervention in Haiti. And I have to really shout out the Venezuelan government under Maduro, who absolutely is against this intervention. The other thing is the U.S., France, and Canada, their colonial hold on Haiti has not allowed any other people to actually help Haiti. The reality is, for me, the international community for us would be Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, these three countries in particular who are against intervention, but they're the ones that should actually be having conversations with us, not France and Canada and the US, the same colonial powers that put us where we are, right? And so part of that is the rest of the Caribbean are neo-colonial governments that are going along with it. The Latin American countries are either staying silent or pushing, especially Lula, are pushing for this intervention. And Lula should know better because in 2004, it was Brazil's army that led the armed military intervention in Haiti. And those of us who are leftists should actually hold them accountable for pushing for yet another armed intervention to cause death and misery for Haitian people, because that's really what this means. It's like a lot of us are going to be killed so that U.S. can establish its military presence, a formal military presence in the region.
No, very well taken point. Mexico also sort of more quietly, but doing a lot to support the national police.
Yes.
Well, we really appreciate it and appreciate all your work and the work of the Black Alliance for Peace and Black Agenda Report to illuminate this. Dr. Jemima Puryear, professor of global race at the University of British Columbia and a member of the Black Alliance for Peace. As always, thanks so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Rania? Eugene, it's like always the same countries just ganging up on Gaza, on Haiti, on the Congo.
Yeah.
It seems to be a pattern. It's almost like there's some sort of international alliance of like countries that hate the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, since 1820, they've been trying to keep Haiti down. It really is amazing. And it's, if you have the access to go back and look at, say, the archives of New York Times or older newspapers in America, you should go back and look at the U.S. intervention from 1915 to 1933. And what'll be interesting to you is the discourse was exactly the same before the occupation, which, of course, made Haiti 1,000 times worse. But, of course, they looted the National Bank, the gold, the Treasury. Unbelievable situation. But, yeah, the reason, though, if you spend any time in Haiti, if you look at what has taken place in Haiti recently, the 2004 coup was mentioned. They don't want Haiti to have sovereignty because Haiti would be a very progressive country. I mean, the only two times Haitians have had a real vote in the past 30 or 40 years, 1991 or 1990 and 2004, of course, they have voted for a pro-poor movement that was moving towards social justice, wanted to have solidarity with Cuba and so on and so forth. And so it's not, by accident, because they understand that if there's sovereignty for the Haitian people, they'll reclaim their economy, they'll get rid of the sweatshop economy, they'll start working with the progressive nations of the region and the world, and that because of the moral authority of the Haitian Revolution, this will rebound massively across the globe. Maurice Bishop in Grenada, which doesn't have anything like the history of Haiti, said the same thing about attempts to overthrow him. He said, of course they want to overthrow me because they know that if people see a black socialist in the Caribbean, that they're going to look differently about socialism and communism, even inside of the United States. States, and it could affect global politics. Similar issue with Haiti.
Exactly.
Well, we're going to keep moving here, and we want to move towards some important events happening as it concerns the ongoing solidarity movement with Palestine that is sweeping the globe, but certainly here in North America very, very strongly. And we are very, very honored to be joined once again by Yara Shufani, who is a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement, to talk more about this. Yara, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, great to have you here. And, we've been talking with yourself and other members of PYM, over this whole thing about this whole 7 months about this massive movement. I mean, we've seen the largest Palestine protest in the history of America, the largest Palestine protest in the history of Canada. We've seen huge shifts politically in every way. We've seen the student encampments. I won't go on and on and on, but I say that to say that in Detroit and in just a couple weeks, I think at the end of May, the 24th to the 26th, there's going to be the People's Conference for Palestine. So tell us where a conference fits in this broader arc of solidarity and resistance and protest that we've seen here in the U.S. and in Canada and, of course, around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe if we had this conversation 3 weeks ago, I would have started right away with the conference. But just to say that, the resurgence that we're seeing in the Palestine movement right now within the student movement has also kind of shaken the world in so many ways. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, we have seen student encampments popping up in over 150 universities. And really what we're seeing here is the student movement re-energizing the Palestinian national liberation struggle in a very needed way. As you all know, we've entered, I think now month 7, or we've entered month 8 of the genocide against the Palestinian people, which has claimed over 40,000 lives, has wreaked havoc and destruction on Gaza, and we've seen different peaks and waves in the broader solidarity movement across the world. Back in November, we saw hundreds of thousands of people gather in DC and then later in Ottawa, Canada, and all across the world weekly as well. But just a surge in mass mobilizations, which really showed us that the masses of people across the world stand with Palestine. And then, just a few months later, we saw coordinated shut it down actions really, really take over not only the United States, but Canada and Europe, which showed us that people are not only willing to engage in mass mobilizations, but that they're willing to actually challenge and shut down halls of power, areas where capitalism and imperialism are at their most concrete. And it showed us that people across the world are ready to take risks and do so much in order to try to stop this war and in order to be part of an anti-imperialist struggle that is being built or rebuilt, perhaps is a better word here, around Palestine. And the last few weeks have shown us the role that students can play and must play in this struggle. From the first encampment that was launched at Columbia University, which was violently repressed by the NYPD, only to then drive even more energy into the movement and to result in not only Columbia University rebuilding its encampment, but also many, many encampments, over 150 that would follow. And I think that now is the time and is the most important time for us to convene across different areas of the movement in order to discuss the developments of the last 7 months, in order to strategize on the next few months, but also not only the next few months, but the future of the Palestine movement. And this is part of a really, really long history for Palestinians. We as Palestinians have convened regularly in moments of crisis, actually dating back before the Nakba, the catastrophe, which was the mass exodus and forced exile of over 750,000 Palestinians on May 15th, 1948, which we are just a few days from commemorating yet again. But even before the Nakba, Palestinians were convening popular conferences and mass conferences from the first Arab Women's Congress in October 26, 1929, to the Youth Conference in December 1932, and so many more, which actually laid the foundation or helped lay the foundation for the Great Peasant Revolution of 1936 to 1939, where Palestinians were so close to bringing British Empire to its knees and defeating Zionist colonization. And then we saw, yet another really important conference take place on October 18th, 1975, which was, the largest public gathering of Palestinians inside the Zionist entity since 1948 in Nazareth. And this conference helped lay the foundation for what is now commemorated as Land Day. And so really conferences have had this long history in the Palestinian struggle. And of course, beyond the Palestinian struggle, we know global South movements have also used conferences as a way to convene revolutionary forces and to help drive forward new stages of revolution. And so on May 24th to 26th, the Palestinian Youth Movement, alongside over 14 other co-conveners, including National Students for Justice in Palestine, Al-Auda, the Palestinian Feminist Collective, the People's Forum, Answer Coalition, and many, many others are going to be coming together in Detroit in order to continue this revolutionary tradition of conferences playing a role in re-energizing revolutionary struggle.
I want to ask you about the re-energizing, just to elaborate on that a bit, because you mentioned that you've got the student movement in the West, essentially, re-energizing Palestinians abroad. So can you explain what you mean by that? Because I find it a really interesting way to look at it in a sort of like synergy on a global scale of what we see happening with the solidarity movement for Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting reflecting on the last 7 months, and there have been, we talk about the heightening of contradictions, right? That this is a moment where it is so clear who the enemy is and who our friends are, right? And that we're building this mass movement that has such a level of political clarity. But of course, as is the case with a genocide that is, waging on for such a long period of time, that is wreaking so much destruction and despair and misery across, not only within Palestine, but also across the world, we've seen at various points in this, demoralization. We have seen, if I compare the level of political clarity we might have had in November and December, when it felt like there's nothing that we couldn't accomplish, when we were able to convene, millions of people across the world regularly. And then, of course, as the genocide continued and as we saw the levels of destruction in Gaza, we started to see more despair within the movement, right? And this despair, of course, of how is it that we have the world behind us and yet we can't end this genocide, right? And the student movement, I think, over the last 3 weeks has really kind of given us hope yet again. And we've seen that in even messages that Palestinians are delivering to the student movement in the West, right? Which is, I think, what you're alluding to, Rania, that there's this kind of hope that we're seeing even of Palestinians back home. I mentioned Colombia earlier, and one of the, I think, most moving things that took place in Colombia, as we saw, was the occupation of Hamilton Hall and its renaming of Hamilton Hall to Hind's Hall in honor of Hind, who is a young girl that was martyred in Gaza. And just a few days ago, I was watching a clip of Hind's mother referencing this renaming, right? And so we're seeing the way in which the student movement is actually bringing or returning levels of political clarity and showing us or reminding us that, yes, even month 7 into this genocide, that people are still with Palestine, that we are still ready to sacrifice so much for Palestine, that students are, occupying spaces on their campuses, not only to call for divestment, but also to call for an end to genocide, not only to centralize the role of the student movement in revolutionary struggle, but also to connect the student movement with the mass movement that we've been seeing built over the last 7 months. And so there's this really kind of incredible resurgence that we're seeing at a moment where I think we were starting to see that level of despair within the movement that is only natural when you've witnessed your people subject to genocide for 7 months, and that despite organizers all across the world pouring their hearts and souls into the struggle, sacrificing so much, personal sacrifices, and so much more, right? Professional sacrifices and so on, and still not being able to end the genocide. And it's natural that we would see levels of despair kind of arise. And so seeing the student movement's ability to kind of re-energize us, to bring that political clarity back into the movement, not to say that it was gone, but we saw segments of it slipping away, is really, really critical. And I think that this conference aims to do exactly that, right? To, on the one hand, convene the masses on a popular level to raise consciousness, right? We've seen people, develop political clarity around the need for a ceasefire, for example, and we've seen people enter the movement for the first time who, had perhaps no position on the Palestinian struggle from all sectors of society. And now is the time for us to take that commitment, to take that consciousness and turn it into long-term political organization, long-term political struggle, and offer a level of political clarity that is needed to allow for us to continue this long battle ahead. And so that's, I think, one of the critical goals of the conference. Another, of course, is to advance the role of political organization. We've seen people from all walks of life enter political organization for the first time. Sectors are organizing around Palestine, whether it be within healthcare, within education, within labor. All kinds of people from all walks of life are starting to see that they need to build political organizations that are capable of fighting Zionism and imperialism long term. And so this conference aims to bring these sectors together and bring these new organizers, these new revolutionaries together in order to pledge a long-term commitment to the Palestinian struggle, and in order to expose and continue to expose Zionism and the U.S. administration's ongoing role in this genocide. And so that's why the conference is actually focused on three tracks. One is the student movement. The other is the track which is called The Battle of Ideas, focused on the role of ideological struggle, the raising of consciousness that we've seen all across the globe over the last 7 months. The third is building power in the heart of empire, confronting Zionism and imperialism. So really kind of showing that we in the belly of the beast have a critical role to play. And then the last, which I already kind of alluded to, is the track 4, which is mobilizing to organizing. So again, really trying to think about, if we, earlier I referenced that conferences have a history in Palestine dating over 100 years ago. So we know that the Palestinian struggle is a long-term struggle that we've been fighting for 100 years. And to prepare to fight for as long as needed, even if it's another 100 years, we need to be prepared to build political organizations that are capable of not only mobilizing people, but organizing people as well.
Mm-hmm. No, well, important point. And just quickly before I ask you one final question, Yara, since we're talking about the student movement, I do have some breaking news here. Xavier University of Louisiana, which is one of the most storied historically black colleges and universities in the United States, has canceled the commencement speech of Linda Thomas Greenfield on Saturday because students had said that they did not want her to come. And I guess they didn't want a big protest. So they have now canceled. She will no longer be there. The president said he didn't want to do it, but, they had no choice. The student body president had actually written to the administrators and said, none of us want this to happen. So just another example of how this is an ongoing movement that's continuing to spread in every corner. So some breaking news there out of Xavier University in New Orleans. Well, before we let you go, Yara, where can people find out more about this conference if they would like to be a part of it?
Yeah, so people can go to People's Conference for Palestine, or you search People's Conference for Palestine, or the exact website is peoplesconferenceforpalestine.org, and you can register there. We have plenty of exciting speakers that are coming, and it's going to be a 3-day long collaborative and political and cultural kind of experience that brings all segments of the movement together. You can register online through the conference website. All of the registration fees are going to Gaza Aid directly. And this is actually part of it's also a political decision that the co-conveners of the conference have made in honor of something that we call in Arabic ta'ziz al-samud, which means supporting the steadfastness of our people. And so all conference registration fees will be going towards Gaza Aid, and we've already actually raised 100,000 for Gaza through this conference, through the registration fees. And this is part of, I think, our role in the FAR diaspora, to be able to act as a cradle and a popular base for our people's struggle, to support their steadfastness, and to get organized, to come together and to convene and strategize for the long battle ahead. And so you can find information on how to register, on accommodation, and all of the information that you need for the conference at peoplesconferenceforpalestine.org.
Mm-hmm. Yara Shufani with the Palestinian Youth Movement. As always, thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Wow, great news about Linda Thomas Greenfield.
Yeah.
Woo! Or should I say boo?
Yeah. Either way you want to look at that, but no, I think that's it's big. Xavier, one of the most well-known HBCUs, especially in the sciences. I don't know if this is still the case, but for many years, more Black doctors had attended undergrad at Xavier than any other university in the country. So, long history there in Louisiana, and certainly if it's coming from the entire student body. I mean, the student body president was the one who wrote the initial letter, I think, expressing the students' outrage that she was coming. But nonetheless, big shout out to Xavier. Major move there. But it speaks to everything that's happening. And of course, we would be remiss, I think, if we didn't say what's happening right now, which is the ongoing intensification of conflict in Rafah. I think there's a little bit of a game being played right now. This whole idea of are they going to invade Rafah? Are they not going to invade Rafah? And this whole what is a full invasion? I mean, I think there's a lot of things we could say, but I think what's important to note here is that they're bombing the hell out of Rafah right now, that they have done some limited incursions, that they have, shelled the tent camps in certain areas. I think, over 400,000, I don't have the number on top of me right now. I had it just a second ago, but I'm losing it, have been forced to leave their homes. Again. 80,000 Palestinians forced to flee Rafah again. I saw several UN officials say that the humanitarian situation is terrible, that no aid has gotten in for the past 2 days. So, I mean, obviously it could certainly get worse if it's a more full-fledged, military invasion. But I think this idea that they're sort of not invading Rafah is confusing in the terms of where it's going, because they have intensified the level of military activity in Rafah.
And just to throw a couple numbers out there, 1.3 million people are sheltering in Rafah, which has been being subjected to bombings, by the way.
Yeah.
It was never free from bombings. It was referred to as though it was some sort of safe zone, but it never really has been. So 1.3 million people sheltering there, 600,000 of them children.
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically like the numbers in Gaza in general, half of them children. It's just completely outrageous to be subjecting this even smaller portion of Gaza to another invasion, and for what? I mean, they don't want their hostages back.
Yeah.
Because they've had the opportunity. I mean, our very own Kay Pritzker just did a segment counting the amount of times that Hamas has agreed to release the hostages since October 7th, and they agreed immediately, by the way, in exchange for Palestinian hostages, which no one ever talks about because apparently their lives don't matter and their freedom doesn't matter. But moreover, Israel does not seem to want their hostages back. They would prefer to continue on their revenge spree across Gaza, across what's left of it. They've destroyed so much of it. Something like 370,000 housing units have been destroyed. They're saying it'll take like 80 years to rebuild Gaza. It's been completely obliterated, completely decimated. And it's just disgusting. There are people still defending and justifying this horror. Like, the priority right now should be to end this genocide. And what we're getting is Israelis obviously are going to defend it. Israeli officials are going to continue to justify it. But American officials are playing a game too, because you've got them saying, oh yeah, we'll stop weapon shipments if they're using weapons against civilians. But that's all in the eye of the beholder when it comes to the U.S. So it seems unclear how this is going to play out in the coming days. But Israel does seem to be very much determined to continue to destroy what's left of Gaza. And so many people's lives are at stake. And it's just utterly shocking to me anybody would continue to defend this horror show. It's like, honestly, it's like Israel's final solution is to destroy Rafah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the case. I mean, they obviously want to push people out. I mean, listen, there's a lot of conversation about, Netanyahu doesn't want to end the war because he doesn't want to be put out of office. And I think there's a certain truth to that for sure. I mean, he's obviously the ultimate political survivor and animal. He's got all these corruption charges hanging over his head. But I actually don't really think that is his primary motivation. Because, I mean, look at the history of Netanyahu. He actually gave a speech many, many years ago in the Knesset. I think it was 1991. And he said, we made a big mistake during Tiananmen Square in 1989. But he said the eyes of the world were on China, and we should have taken that moment to try to push out all the Palestinians. I mean, this is...
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's amazing, And this is the political program, of course, of his party, Likud, and it has been for its entire existence. They have their own one-state solution, that all of sort of greater Israel, from the river to the sea, but also including parts of Lebanon, Syria, in some cases even Egypt, Jordan, other places like that all of that should be controlled by Israel. And so in many ways, if you look at what Netanyahu is doing, to me, it's very consistent with his entire political history and the history and the politics of the Likud party, which is to try to proceed in stages, of course. They've moved backwards, they've moved forwards in different times, but to proceed with the total ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which is, of course, the broader Zionist project, but Likud has always been one of the more aggressive in pushing that project in a general sense, and certainly in the past, let's say 5 or 6 years, significantly. So to me, it feels like the battle is joined for them. They did this after October 7th. They're this deep into it. So why would they stop now? Because ultimately, this is their goal, to try to get out all the Palestinians, at least as many of them as they can. And this is a sort of easy opportunity for them to do so. It's maybe not easy because they're facing a lot of resistance, but it's the best opportunity for them to do so in some time. And so they are pursuing it and pushing it forward. And I think it's important to recognize that the United States shares that goal. I mean, John Kirby in his press conference today said, the ultimate defeat of Hamas is their goal, and that is also our goal. And, that's like Hamas as a boogeyman really just means the Palestinian resistance and the organizations that Palestinian people have built over decades to resist apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, because that is the basis by which the United States can impose the solution that they want on the region. And so I've said from the beginning, there is a parallel between the two. There's not an exact equivalence, I think. I don't think the U.S. is 100. I don't think they need all Palestinians to be pushed out whatsoever. I don't know if they even want that necessarily. But what they want is a Bantustan style reality, what the apartheid government in South Africa was proposing for blacks. They want to have a Bantustan style Palestinian state, which they can then use to manipulate the reactionary regimes in the region to create a sort of security structure that can then keep in check, this is their view, the axis of resistance structure in sort of a Cold War type scenario, so that the two sides balance each other and the U.S. can pivot to Asia and try to wage a war with China. So it's just as important for the United States to crush the will of the Palestinian people to resist. The will of the Palestinian people to resist has never been crushed, and thus the genocide is ongoing, and thus the U.S. support is ongoing. So they're playing all these little games to help themselves in the elections, to help themselves in the eyes of history or whatever they're doing. But ultimately, the two sides have basically the same goal with slight differences in terms of what they want the final dispensation to be for Palestinians.
Right. And at this point, I think you make a really good point about no matter what happens moving forward, Palestinians are never going to stop fighting for their existence. They're never going to stop fighting for their land. They're never going to stop fighting for their survival. And that's something the Israelis don't seem to get. You've tried it for 76 years and it hasn't worked. They could do a great deal of damage. I'm not sitting here suggesting Israel's some easy enemy for somebody to come and get rid of. They're not. Obviously, they're a nuclear-armed state backed by the most violent empire in history. But, Palestinian resistance groups will never stop.
If you don't surrender after this,
Yeah.
what else could they do?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, the
So
people, it's a
militarily,
famine.
all
They've
that's-
destroyed all the infrastructure.
Well, all that's to say, like, militarily, they can't defeat the Palestinians. They cannot defeat the military aspects of their neighbors either. So in many ways, like, Israel is stuck. And so it's kind of like, I mean, I'm not saying Israel has to do Rafah, but it's kind of like from their vantage point as this like settler state that looks quite weak in many ways over the last 7 months, they almost don't have a choice if there's no one who's going to stop them.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's fight now or fight later.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you think prior to October 7th, which it's hard to remember that,
Yeah.
but so much of the discourse was how much longer can Israel keep going with these extreme policies under Netanyahu before something happens? So I think if you believe in Zionism as a colonial project, which all of these Israeli parties do, then ultimately you're either going to fight now or you're going to fight later, because the Palestinians will never give up, and all of the countries surrounding you don't think that you have a legitimate political project. And I would say a majority of the world also doesn't think you have a legitimate political project. So the only real option you have is to try to find a way to escalate, to, as the Israelis say, shape the facts on the ground. And we talk about the parallels with South Africa. This is exactly why South Africa invaded Angola in 1978, because it was such a pariah country. They were completely surrounded by all of the frontline states who were becoming more powerful because of their connection with the Soviet Union and so on and so forth militarily. The ANC and the PAC after Soweto in 1976 were only getting stronger, and they're right there on the borders. They're getting more bold in the type of actions they're willing to carry out. And so ultimately they figured you had to expand, because unless they took over Namibia and basically destroyed Angola, Zambia, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe, they knew that they would be gone in short order. Now, of course, what happened is they overreached so far, it accelerated the decline of the apartheid government. But again, when you have a totally illogical settler colonial project that doesn't have the support of anyone really in the world in any significant amount, and certainly in the broader region as isolated, no matter what you do, it's doomed to failure, in my point of view, because it's not a viable political entity.
Right.
It's an entity that's been imposed and enshrined and is backed up by the U.S., but even look at the Iranian drone thing. Without the U.S., the U.K., Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and probably 3 or 4 other countries that we don't know about, they would not have been able to stop even sort of a symbolic attack by Iran. So, of course, if Iran sent like 5,000 drones and missiles, it would hurt them. And so ultimately you can see that the contradictions, just like South Africa, of this sort of implanted, imposed project, it can't hold. So ultimately you fight now or you fight later. You want to extend the process of the settler colonial project. It's really their only result. And they're taking the opportunity after October 7th to push that. That's why they're talking about going to war in Lebanon. I mean, it's insane and warlike, but there's a perverse logic to it if what you want to do is support the settler colonial enterprise.
And we're supposed to think Israel's the victim. I mean, when you lay it out like that, it's just completely insane to hear this insane thought process of Israel's such a victim surrounded by so many enemies. Maybe just don't be a colony.
And this is the thing that I feel people have to learn the history. I mean, there's a good book, Israel, Palestine, and U.S. Empire, the author of which was on Brian's show, The Socialist Program, recently. You can buy it at 1804books.com. But they were very open about this being a colony. I mean, they were talking amongst themselves and saying we could never survive unless we're backed by these imperial powers. And then they're deliberately, directly writing to the British colonialists and saying, if you back us, we will support you. In the most racist language ever, we'll be your bulwark against the Asian hordes trying to overtake the European whatever. So from the very beginning, and before they were going to Israel, they thought they might be going to Uganda or Argentina.
Yeah.
So, it's like from the very beginning, it's been a settler colonial project. The Zionist forefathers were very open about that, and we just have to keep propounding that, because there's some idea, this mythical 2,000 years ago. I mean, I don't want to get into 2,000 years of history, but if this is the rule, then Muslims have to take over Spain once again. France actually should be just totally dismantled into various different parts. There should be no Netherlands, right? Because that was a part of the Spanish Empire at one point as well. Germany, Switzerland, Italy should be broken apart. Let's bring back the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, America, let's get rid of America and have the Native Americans in charge of every single thing.
And that was not 2,000 years ago.
No, it was a lot sooner than that. So it's like this completely ridiculous idea. Like, I actually don't even buy that as a justification.
Like a white girl from Poland is indigenous to the Middle East.
It's absurd. It's
To West
completely
Asia.
absurd.
It is
It's
insane.
completely
It is
absurd.
insane.
So anyway, let's leave it at that. We could go on all day talking about how ridiculous this whole thing is and the falsity of it on so many levels. That'll do it for us here today on our show, The Freedom Side. Of course, you're on YouTube, so to remind you again, hit subscribe, hit the bell so you get the things that you have subscribed to easily. And Rania, before we go, what else should our viewers know?
Our viewers should know that in order to keep Breakthrough News going, if you are able, please do become a member for as little as $5 a month by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. You can access exclusive content, and more importantly, you can keep independent media like Breakthrough News going so we can keep bringing you the reality of what's happening in the world.
Indeed. Well, as always, for our Breakthrough News team, thanks to everybody who joined as a guest, everyone who joined as a viewer, and of course, all our patrons, and we will see you next time.